Hi, my name is Bob Wheeler, and welcome to the Berean Observer, where we search the scriptures daily to see whether or not these things are true. What we're seeing today in modern Western culture, and especially here in America, is this very loose kind of sexual morality. We're seeing a high divorce rate. We're seeing couples cohabiting with each other, and we're seeing people addicted to porn. And the result, I think, is what we're seeing is the disintegration of the family structure, with a large percentage of children growing up in dysfunctional single parent families, having little or no contact with their biological fathers. And this is something that goes back to the sexual revolution of the 1960s. Back in the early 1960s, when birth control first became available, you began to see college and high school students experimenting with premarital sex. And then you had the rise of the hippie movement in 1965. This is partially a reaction to the Vietnam War, but it also has very strong countercultural emphasis. And among other things, they began practicing free love. You had people living in communes, and you had them practicing polyamorous relationships and that sort of thing. Then we had the women's liberation movement, which arose in the 1970s, and as we saw last week, basically challenged the whole idea of gender roles. And then there was gay liberation, which began with the famous Stonewall Inn riots that took place in June of 1969. And then there was a strong push to try to legitimize homosexuality. Finally, the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in December of 1973. Now, you want to keep in mind is that this kind of points to a problem with secular psychology. It likes to present itself as a scientific approach to treating things. People who have behavior problems are said to be mentally ill, and they need therapy, and so on. But the problem is that you wind up on the basis of secular philosophy, how exactly to determine what is normal. Okay, what is normal and what is abnormal? And prior to 1973, homosexuality was regarded as a mental illness. That if you what was normal was to be attracted to the opposite sex. So if you had a sexual attraction to the same sex, there was something obviously abnormal to you. And so then, according to the American Psychiatric Association, it was a form of mental illness. So then they removed it from their Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in 1973. And it was because of some scientific discovery that they made that they found out that all of a sudden homosexuality is really normal? No, it was basically the result of political pressure the gay activists put on them. Then all of this kind of spilled over into the popular culture, and I can remember Janis Joplin, for example, a leading rock singer, and she performed at the Woodstock Festival back in August of 1969. And her own life was just a tragic mess. She was heavy into drugs and alcohol. She had multiple romantic relationships with both men and women. Finally, she died in 1970 from a heroin overdose. But she was noted for singing songs like "One Good Man," "I Need a Man to Love," "A Woman Left Lonely," and "One Night Stand," which all kind of reflected that very loose sexual morality that became very common at that particular point in time. So the question then is, what is the biblical answer to all of this? And so this week we continue in our study in Romans chapter 1, and this time we read verses 24 through 27, which says, "Therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness in the lusts of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for the lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to vile passions, for even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature. Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another, men with men, committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error which was due." Now, reading that from the New King James Version. Now, it's interesting that he begins by talking about sexual immorality in general in verse 24, where it says, "Therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness in the lusts of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies among themselves." And it's interesting, it starts off by saying that God gave them up. And the implication is that up until that point, God had been exercising kind of a restraining influence on human society. And then what he did was he withdrew that restraining influence and let people follow their own natural passions and desires. And the result was widespread sexual immorality. So, for example, he talks about the uncleanness and the lusts of their hearts. So we're talking about, self-centered passions to dishonor their bodies among themselves. That basically what happened with sexual immorality, of course, is it involves the use of your human body, and that basically there's a certain sense in which you're kind of dishonoring your body by participating in sexual immorality. Then he goes on to elaborate on specific cases. So, for example, he talks about lesbianism in verse 26. He says, "For this reason, God gave them up to vile passions, for even their women exchanged the natural use for what is against nature." And of course, when he talks about vile passions, he's talking about intense emotions and desires that are shameful and disgraceful. And what's especially interesting here is that he talks about the natural use. Uh, he says for even their women exchange the natural use for what is against nature. So, in other words, what Paul is saying here is something that I think should be kind of obvious. That when you think in terms of the natural use of our sexual organs, of human sexuality, that basically the natural use would be heterosexual reproduction. Okay, the sperm fertilizes the egg, and that's how a baby comes into existence. That would be the natural use of our sexual organs. But instead, what happened was that they would engage in sexual practices with other women. So then he goes on in verse 27 to talk about male homosexuality. "Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust for one another, men with men, committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error which was due." And here again it says they burned with lust. And I think it's important to realize that there's a big difference between sexual lust and love. Okay, sexual lust is an intense physical desire, intense desire for physical pleasure, and it's self-centered. Okay, whereas genuine love means that you genuinely care about the other person, you're attracted to that person, and you've committed yourself to advancing that person's best interest. And so there's a huge difference between engaging in promiscuous sex and genuinely loving the other person. And homosexuality typically involves that, multiple relationships, sometimes with anonymous relationships, where men are just looking for sexual pleasure for its own sake. And then it says, "Committing what is shameful," again, so contrary to nature that we should find it shameful, a perversion of what God created for different purposes. So, in other words, when gay men wind up engaging in oral and anal sex, that's kind of an ugly perversion of what God did. Our sexual organs were not designed for that kind of thing, and it's kind of disgusting. Then it says that they would receiving in themselves the penalty of their error, which was due. There's a little bit of confusion over what exactly Paul meant by that. A lot of commentators have taken the position that homosexuality itself is a punishment from God for their abandonment of the true God. And it could be argued, if you look at the overall context of the passage, that, well, yeah, in a way, that's what God's talking about. God gave them up because they refused to acknowledge Him as Creator and Lord. But you can't also help but wonder when it says that they received in themselves the penalty, that it might be talking about some forms of sexually transmitted diseases, such as AIDS, for example. Although I don't think AIDS necessarily existed back in the days of the Apostle Paul. He certainly never would have heard of it. And then the ultimate reason for that, and this is the key thing, I ask you, well, why did this sexual revolution take place in the first place? And the Apostle Paul says that the ultimate reason for it was in verse 5. Well, starting in verse 4 says, "Therefore God also gave them up to uncleanness," and so on. And the reason is because they exchanged the truth of God for the lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. And this is something, of course, that we went into in some detail last week in our last video. But it says that they worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator. And that's the whole problem. When people turn away from God, who is the infinite, omnipotent creator, they wind up worshiping something else or nothing at all. So they give up what's infinite with something that is not infinite. They give up God for something that's less than God, which is just sheer insanity. Why in the world would a rational, intelligent person do a thing like that? So then that raises the question, so what exactly is the ultimate purpose of human sexuality? Why did God create us as sexual beings in the first place? And what we're going to find is that, this is like one of these passages that homosexuals call clobber passages because it comes across as such a very strong condemnation of homosexuality. And so some gay rights activists will try to argue, but Jesus himself never condemned homosexuality. Well, it is true that we don't have any record of him explicitly discussing the subject, but if we take a look at what Jesus said about sex and marriage in general, we'll get a whole different picture. So, example, if you go back to the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is basically elaborating on the true nature of morality, and it's not just simply external conformity to a set of rules, but rather it's the inward disposition of the heart. And so he winds up saying in Matthew 5, verses 27 and 28, he says, "You have heard that it was said of old, 'You shall not commit adultery,' which of course is one of the 10 Commandments. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in her heart." In other words, even though he hasn't actually physically touched her and sexually abused her, nevertheless, the fact that he was thinking about it, the desire was in his heart, in the sight of God, that was just about as bad as having committed the act itself. The fact of it is he had a desire to commit adultery, even if he didn't actually physically do it. All right? And so basically what Jesus is doing here, instead of lowering the bar of morality and saying, well, we can now tolerate things that were forbidden in the Old Testament, instead he's raising the bar. He's making the moral law of God even stricter and more stringent than what maybe some of the Jews of his day would have thought. And then in chapter 19, Matthew 19, Jesus goes into an interesting discussion about the subject of divorce, and he talks about the nature of marriage in general. So Matthew 19, verses 3 through 12, says, "The Pharisees also came to him, testing him and saying to him, 'Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason?' And he answered and said to them, 'Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female? And he said, For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate.' They said to him, 'Why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away?' He said to them, 'Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery.'" So in other words, what was going on here was that the Pharisees were asking him a question. There's a passage in Deuteronomy chapter 24, which talks about how that if somebody wants to divorce his wife, he should write out a bill of divorce and give it to her. And then there arose a debate that arose among different schools of rabbinical thought about what exactly are the legitimate grounds for a divorce. So on the one hand, there's a stricter school called the School of Shammai that said that basically what the passage is referring to is sexual immorality, is unchastity. And then there was another school, the School of Hillel, that said that took a broader view and said that he could decide to divorce his wife for any reason whatsoever. It even says even if she spoiled a dish for him. So with this debate going on among the Jewish rabbis, it was almost inevitable that at some point somebody would ask Jesus to weigh in on the subject. And so that's what he does here in this passage in Matthew. So what happens then is that what Christ does then is he kind of circumvents the passage in Deuteronomy, and he goes back to the creation narrative in the book of Genesis, and basically asks the question, so what did God intend when he created us in the first place? So he says in verses 4 and 5, he says, "Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female?" So, in other words, human sexuality was something that was created by God for a specific reason and purpose. And it was God who made us male and female. And then he says, "And for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." So, in other words, the reason why God made us male and female was so that we would engage in a sexual relationship with people of the opposite sex. And notice that he says that they should become one flesh. In other words, it's supposed to be such an intense and personal relationship with one another that they're almost like they're not even two separate human beings anymore, but they're joined together into one. And then he says in verse 6 that the marriage bond is supposed to be permanent. He says, "So then, they are no longer two but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate." In other words, it was God who ordained the institution of marriage, and therefore a human government, a human court, doesn't have the right to break up that marriage. God intended it for it to be permanent. And then he goes on to say in verse 9, he elaborates a little bit and he says, "And I say to you that whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery." So in other words, adultery is the only legitimate grounds for divorce. And so in that sense, he's taking a stricter view held by the school of Shammai. And aside from that, marriage is supposed to be a permanent binding institution between one man and one woman. And that's what God intended when he made us. That's the whole purpose of human sexuality. And so then you ask the question then, so in light of all that, what do you think Christ would have said about homosexuality? Would he have condoned that if he would condemn a heterosexual man simply for lusting after a woman in his heart? What do you think? Okay. So basically what it boils down to is that human sexuality was something that was created by God for a specific reason and purpose, and that is heterosexual reproduction. I think it's interesting that when you take a look at our sexual organs, you're looking at intelligent design. Okay? They were designed to function a certain way and to fulfill a certain purpose, and that was heterosexual reproduction. So then, homosexual license, including homosexuality, is actually a judgment from God because of our secularism, our refusal to acknowledge God as creator. And I think a lot of it goes back directly to some Supreme Court decisions that were made in the very early 1960s about the separation of church and state. And you had the case of Engel versus Vitale, sometimes known as the Regent's Prayer case, that was decided in 1962. And then you had the following year, you had the Abington Town School District versus Schempp in 1963. And what happened in those cases was the Supreme Court interpreted the Establishment Clause in the Constitution, the First Amendment, to mean that not only can the federal government favor one religion over another, it can't favor any religion at all. And unfortunately, that put the federal government in a position where it could no longer acknowledge the existence of a supreme being. It had to because it had to treat atheism on the same plane as Christianity or Judaism or any other religion. And so what it basically boils down to is that as things stand since then, the federal government is officially atheistic. We are about as Christian a nation, at least as far as the government goes, as the old Soviet Union or communist China. And that creates a very, very serious problem, because what it means then is that we've departed from the principle on which the Republic was founded. In the Declaration of Independence, and this year is going to be the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the Founding Fathers laid down the basic principle, the rationale behind a democratic government. And so it said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So what happened then is that they acknowledged the Founding Fathers acknowledged that they weren't necessarily Christian in the strict biblically orthodox sense, but they at least took for granted the existence of a supreme being and the idea of a universally binding moral law. And according to modern secularism, that statement is just plain false. There is no creator. But then that in turn raises some very, very serious questions. First of all, what makes us equal? We weren't created by an intelligent supreme being, um, and therefore there's no like human essence that defines us as human beings. So how are we equal? We're all different, you know. And some people are rich, some people are poor, some people are very intelligent, some people are mentally retarded, some people are Olympic atheists, athletes, some people are physically disabled. So how are we equal? You know, and if we've all evolved, from animals, lower forms of life, you know, how can we say that there's some kind of a human essence that we don't share a common ancestry? So how can you say that there's some kind of a human essence that unites us as human beings? And then this in turn led to the moral problem. Okay, where do human rights come from? If there is no universally binding moral law, okay, um, then what makes anything right or wrong? So then eventually you wound up with the infamous decision of Roe versus Wade in 1973, which raises, so again, some very, very serious questions. So is there anything sacred about human life? What constitutes a human being? Is an unborn child a human being? Does he have a right to life that's guaranteed by the 5th and the 14th Amendments of the Constitution? And even to this day, with a conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court, even though they overturned Roe v. Wade, they simply referred the whole issue back to the individual states, and were unprepared to say that an unborn child has a right to life, an unalienable right to life, that is guaranteed by the 5th and 14th, the Due Process and Equal Protection Clauses of the 5th and 14th Amendments. And so that's how morally bankrupt modern America has become. And with all this, and the result of sexual revolution then has basically resulted in the disintegration of the family structure and social chaos. And I think that this is eventually going to result in the collapse of democracy. Frankly, in order for a human society to function, it has to have a commonly agreed upon set of rules and regulations where people recognize they're not out here just to live for their own individual self-interest, but they're a part of a larger human society, and they have to work together collectively for the common good. And modern American society has become so narcissistic and so focused on individual rights and liberties. My body, my choice, you see. I mean, you even have people on the conservative side when COVID vaccines came out, who were repeating the slogan of the feminists, my body, my choice. And you're forgetting, completely overlooking the fact you're talking about a national health emergency with a highly contagious, highly fatal disease spreading through the country. We needed to cooperate with the authorities to protect innocent human life. And you even have people self-professed conservatives who refuse to do that. And so what will eventually happen is that people have no sense of moral accountability to anyone beyond themselves. The result is that they won't obey the law simply because it's the law. They don't believe in the rule by law. And so that means that the only way that you can possibly maintain order in society is through some kind of an authoritarian government, which is where we're headed. If there's no supreme being, there is no higher law, and there's nothing to restrain the government. And and I think, and I'm very, very pessimistic about the future here of America, but I think that ultimately the only real solution to the problem is a widespread religious revival, which means the church, the evangelical Christian church, needs to get right with God. It needs to humble itself before God, acknowledge its dependence on Him, and realize and ask for an outpouring of the Holy Spirit, and realize the salvation has the result of a work of God's grace in the heart. Okay, and there are churches out there today that want to deny that. It's all a matter of people exercising their own free will to decide on their own what they want to believe, and we'll never have a revival with that kind of theology. So I'd ask that you take all of that to heart, and that if you're a Christian, you'd pray about it, and that you would ask yourself, what we need to humble ourselves before God and pray for an outpouring of the Holy Spirit. And if you're not a Christian, you need to take a look at where society is headed and the kind of destruction, even self-destruction, that we're inviting upon ourselves. And you ask yourself, is that really where you want to go? And the solution is to get right with God and to live your life on this in a way that's pleasing to Him. So I hope you take all that into consideration, and we thank you for listening and hope you'll hear us again. Bye now.